Alrighty, we are going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone. Welcome to the Network for Social Work Management's Future Series, Webinar 1, Futures Thinking for Post-Normal Times, a new resource for social work. My name is Idalia and I am the Administrative Coordinator for the network. I will also serve as today's moderator. Today's presenter is Dr. Laura Nissen, professor and the first inaugural Presidential Futures Fellow at Portland State University. Before we get started, there are a few logistics you should be aware of. Today's webinar is being recorded and you are currently in a listen view only mode. This means that you are muted and unable to turn on your camera. The webinar recording and slide deck will be available within 48 hours on our website in the webinar archive section. We'd like for today's webinar to be as interactive as possible. Therefore, we encourage you to converse throughout the webinar using the chat feature. If you have any questions based on what Dr. Nissen shares, please use the Q&A option to submit your questions. Some questions will be answered throughout the webinar. However, the majority will be answered in the last 30 minutes of the presentation. If you have any questions regarding the webinar functions, please send me a private chat directly and I will assist you. Last, we'd like to know who is in the room. So let's take a few minutes for introductions. Using the chat, please tell us who you are, what you do, and where you are zooming in from. And I see a few people here. Hello from Denver, St. Louis. Good morning, good afternoon. Hi, Tracy from California. Hello and good morning from Vancouver. Great, people from New York. Michigan. It's so great to see everyone here in this space. All right, so I would now like to introduce you to our presenter. Former Dean and Professor Dr. Laura Nissen has been a member of the Portland State University School of Social Work Community since 2000. She is currently the first inaugural Presidential Futures Fellow at Portland State. Dr. Nissen had just been awarded a 2-year grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to launch a national social work education health futures lab to explore the power of futures thinking to today and tomorrow's social work profession. She has brought futures thinking into the School of Social Work in the form of the first strategic plan at the school since its 55-year history. She is a foresight practitioner and a research fellow within the Institute for the Future and has spoken on futures thinking on social work and social change at the National Association of Deans and Directors for Schools of Social Work and in numerous social work education and community spaces. Dr. Nissen, thank you so much for taking the time to engage us in this timely conversation. So without further ado, take it away.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It is great to be with so many social workers from all over the country and beyond. I'm thrilled to have some time with you, and I welcome you to this space this morning to think about futures thinking for post-normal times and what I believe it has to offer to the profession of social work. So, I want to start where we are. Probably never has the idea of post-normal times been more relevant. Normally, the number one challenge futurists face is getting people to think about the future in a meaningful way. But COVID has been a powerful and brutal teacher. We're all in a bit of the upside down right now. The definition of post-normal times comes from a writer named Zardar from 2010. All that was normal has now evaporated. We've entered post-normal times, the in-between period where old orthodoxies are dying, new ones have not yet emerged, and nothing really makes sense. To have any viable future, we must grasp the significance of this period of transition, which is characterized by the 3 C's: complexity, chaos, and contradictions. I think we all have a visceral understanding. Before I start, I'd just like to take a moment of silence to recognize all the lives that have been lost all over the world. So if you'll just join me in a moment of unity and recognition. So futures thinking, the point of this webinar, I'll talk more about it, is to really dive into what it is. And so I'll be presenting a variety of definitions and sort of opportunities for you to feel what futures thinking is like. But I offer a couple of definitions that I love. Critical future studies asserts that the present is fragile, merely the victory of one particular discourse, one way of knowing over another. The goal of futures thinking is to disturb present power relations through making our categories problematic and evoking other scenarios to, in many ways, undefine the future. One of my other favorites here is the greatest existential challenge facing the human species can in part be traced to the fact that we have underdeveloped practices for thinking possible worlds out loud. But as we go into this conversation, you know, the way I might have done this 4 or 5 months ago, obviously, like everyone, might be totally different. We all have a major distraction in front of us. The times have changed. So I want to meet us where we are and understand that we're doing futures thinking in the middle of a pandemic. We're exploring how this might work. We do it to honor good work that we do, meaningful work, useful work, energizing work. And I do believe futures thinking can deeply energize what we're about in social work. I think we're going to be, as we move on in history, there'll be pre-COVID thinking and post-COVID thinking. I think our thinking is going to divide, and we're experiencing that transition together. My purpose with these webinars and with all of my work has been to spark you all, to spark curiosity, passion, and focus for you and your path ahead in the future. Opportunities to make a difference as a social worker in the spaces I'm going to talk about are plentiful. And I want to really underscore, you may not be invited, but you got to go anyway. And my experience has been, as you seek out these spaces to engage in these dialogues, you will be warmly welcomed. I have been extraordinarily welcomed in future spaces, even though I'm usually the only social work and often have to explain what social work is. You will be welcomed. So I heard this, I know Brene Brown did an interview with this author, David Keller, who did an amazing article, I believe in the New York Times recently, about the stages of grief in a COVID-19 world. And I just put these up here to acknowledge that among the 160 people that are on this call right now, we're all somewhere in this. I think joining with the kind of knowledge base we have about how human beings work and social work, we're all on this somewhere. Denial, this virus won't affect us. Anger, you're making me stay home and take away my activities. Bargaining, okay, if I social distance for 2 weeks, everything will be better and we can go back to the way things were. Sadness, I don't know when this will end. Acceptance, this is happening and I have to figure out how to proceed and survive in it. And meaning, we're all connected in ways that have been deeply revealed and transformed. I could almost do a poll right now and say, how many of these stages have you been in the last 24 hours? I mean, I think we're all aware of how complex intellectually, emotionally, from a social justice perspective, as social workers, as humans, as family members, et cetera, community members. These are all deeply complex times. So I want to just acknowledge that, and nothing I'm going to say today is about putting icing over that. I think that futures work is integrally connected to all of these things. So as we link to futures thinking and COVID-19, futurists are asking the question, how will COVID-19 change the world? So history matters. I'll talk more about that. History tells us that pandemics do change the world. How is this time going to change the ecosystem we live and practice in? What kind of world do we want to go back to? What choices do we have about that? How will COVID-19 change us individually and in communities around the world? How will it expand us, evolve us, strengthen us, test us, challenge us, improve us, threaten us, and force us? And how big can we allow our imaginations to get about what that might look like or what that might mean? How can we start imagining and preparing for our role in recovery? There will be a need for healing like probably nothing any of us have experienced in our lifetimes in terms of one global need, which is to recover from what's happening. And how must the social work profession be ready for that? So far, and this image is from a wonderful futurist I urge you to look up named Leah Zadie. She calls COVID-19 an unevenly distributed dystopia. The future is here. And it's a future that many futurists worried about and many planners and epidemiologists predicted. The future is complicated, and in many ways, it's unpredictable. It's unevenly distributed. In order to navigate it, we probably need new ways to operate. So futures thinking, I believe, helps to provide some of that possible architecture. And I want to just share it with you all, really share my journey to bring you into that. So as I said, the purpose of these webinars over the next couple of weeks is to introduce this thinking formally to our profession and explore its goodness of fit with our social justice, equity, and well-being goals, and then invite you to get involved. So the webinar today is about what is it? What is futures thinking? The webinar next week is what's the process of foresight, the sort of verb. How does futures practice work, and how can it enhance in a preliminary way what social work is and what it will be. And then the third webinar is really about how do we create possibility spaces for the future of our profession and the future of social justice. How do we anticipate some of the things I'm going to talk about today and how they may change the landscape of what equity means, of what racism means, of what healing means. So all things to be considered, but the ideal is that this 3 webinar series is a dialogue and a sequential dialogue. So in case I know many of you, I see some friends online, but in case you don't know me, I come with 30 years of social work practice and education. I have been primarily working in addiction spaces and systems change spaces around that. I had very early career experiences with futures thinking related to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and I found them to be very seminal experiences as a social worker related to the ideas, the versatility, the agility that results with futures work as an alternative to really strategic planning. So there's more flex in futures work and in foresight. The last few years, I've shifted my career really to all futures all the time. And gathering that journey in terms of what's it like when a social worker becomes a futurist on a blog called socialworkfutures.com. And I really have to thank and credit Dean Nancy Smith at University of Buffalo for encouraging me to do that, to learn out loud and to do that bravely and sometimes imperfectly, but to offer an opportunity to learn with me. And I continue to think of these webinars as being the continuation of that process. So this work has dearly inspired, energized, and activated me in a really good way. The liberatory possibilities, I think, of futures thinking and the richness of the global practice community in these spaces is extraordinary, and I found it to be really inspiring. I plan to devote the balance of my career, frankly, to sparking interest for social workers to be fully part of the futures community. We belong in these spaces. And we need to help get the profession of social work ready for what's coming next. So that is how I got here. So I think it's time to go. Let's go to the future. So we'll all just take a deep breath and think about your own future this morning. I'm going to take you through an overview of futures thinking, principles, and practice, talk about different ways futures practice, some of the focus areas. We'll look at some maps of the future. I'll share some notable examples of futures thinking, especially in spaces that I think are very relevant to social workers. We'll talk about ethics. And then I want to just talk about what's coming. How is the future coming at us that I think is also especially relevant to social work? And then one little teaser as a bridge to the next session, which is how futures practice works. I'll show you something called artifacts of the future and give you just a little taste of what futures practice feels like. So again, with that deep breath, I'm going to call on all of you to think about your own future. Think about yourself as an embodied human being with a head and a heart and hands. You have a future, and the future is abstract, but it's also not abstract. You spend a fair amount of your life thinking about your own future. You think about your partners, your families, your close friends, your extended family. You may think about your job, your own career trajectory. Where do I want to be in 10 years? That kind of thing. Your discipline. What's the future of social work? Right now, like in social work, we're talking a lot about the the differences in strategies and synergies between DSWs and PhDs? That's a futures kind of question. Our disciplinary ecosystem, your city, your state, your tribe, your country, your planet, all of these things are changing and evolving in both predictable and unpredictable ways. Your consciousness interacts with ideas of the future all the time. So this isn't a concept that's completely outside what you've normally done. But futures thinking sort of takes that up a notch. And it says, what if you really spent time both qualitatively and quantitatively focusing on this issue? Futures thinking is about deepening and strengthening the ability to anticipate in a variety of really creative ways. It's about committing to reduce short-termism, which is almost a pathology in our immediate and extended circles of influence. And I think that's one of the things COVID is teaching us right now, right? Short-termism can be dangerous. We must include longer term ways of thinking. How can futures thinking help us make better decisions, deeper commitment to exploring things like unintended consequences and underdeveloped possibilities? Futures thinking is also about resisting powerful actors who dictate what the future is going to be, in favor of increasing agency and democracy in co-constructing desired futures, while protecting and resisting undesired futures. And I'll talk some more about that. Futures thinking isn't neutral, it's powerful. Who gets to wield that power? Is it democratic? Let me assure you, futures thinking has been going on in elite spaces in our world for a long time. But modern futures thinking, and that's for a variety of reasons, but I think as futures thinking has evolved, the idea of democratizing it, the idea that the future isn't something that a few people should decide, the future is something we should decide together in active spaces. It's sort of the ultimate community organizing. What futures thinking offers us right now is a way to connect the past, the present, and the future, to learn from the past, make sense of the present as we deal with it, and connect both of these to an arc of meaning and the choices we have about what happens next. As was said in the beautiful quote at the beginning, to unlearn our way of thinking about what is and isn't possible. And I think COVID has been a brutal, powerful teacher in helping us remember that the veil between what is possible and what is impossible is very porous right now. The futures work that I ascribe to is critical, postmodern, anti-racist, anti-colonial, cultural, interpretive, participatory, and holistic, with a deep bow to an indigenous lens. And indigenous worldviews have long engaged in futures thinking, have long had a commitment to futures generations around the world, although that isn't often talked about. And I do think it's one of the things that social workers do when they enter these spaces is to acknowledge things like that. So part of futures thinking, a big part of it, is getting your thinking to be more elastic and hold different ideas in your mind at the same time in some new ways. Wonderful writer and futurist, Yuval Noah Harari says, things are better than they've ever been. Things are very bad, and things could get much, much worse. And what he says is that these are all true. You don't, if you're really a futures thinker, you sort of don't get to pick one of these. They're all true. And we can all hold them in our minds at the same time. We have to think through, how are they better? And how do we get them to be even better? How are they bad? And how do we interrupt that? And how do we especially prevent about the ways things could get much, much worse? So futures thinking is about agility. And as Bob Johansen, a former president of the, or director of the Institute for the Future, where I'm affiliated, says, the future is about spectrum thinking, not categorical thinking. The future we want doesn't arrive fully formed. We have to shape it. So we both have to attend to the future that we want bravely and creatively, but we also have to do a lot of shaping. So what are different ways of thinking about the future? So the horizontal line there, excuse me, vertical line, the world is getting better, the world is getting worse. We're all, on any given day, we're all somewhere on that continuum. Do we think the world is getting better? Do we think the world is getting worse? And I have to say, as social workers, you know, my guess is a lot of the time we are not looking at the world is getting better part as much. We're deeply engaged in addressing the places where the world is getting worse, and we're trying to devote our life energy to that. Bless us. But the truth is, it's not only getting worse. There are places where it's getting better, and the trick is, how do we use those parts of the world that are getting better to help the parts that are getting worse? But it's a continuum. It's not one or the other. The other side of futures work is what's on the horizontal line, which is I'm able to influence the future, or I'm not able to influence the future. Futures thinking is about boosting agency, individual and collective agency, to influence the future. I think futurists universally believe that the more prepared, the more agile, the more imaginative, and the more collective we are about the way that we work together on futures issues, the more likely it is that we'll have the future we want. Doesn't guarantee it, but it does increase the probabilities. I think that's an underlying assumption. So there's some really fun principles of the future. These come from a futurist who works in forestry, actually. But we love these. And one thing that wasn't mentioned is I run a collaboratory at my university here at Portland State. We've actually adopted this first one as our t-shirt. The future is plural. And the idea behind that is that many scenarios are possible. And we owe it to ourselves and to the future to envision as many of those scenarios as we can. The future is a combination of alternative futures: positive, possible futures, plausible futures, probable, and preferable. And there's even an extra one that gets added now and then: preposterous futures. And sometimes you go to a futures event and awards are given for the most preposterous future we can come up with. But the idea is to help us stretch our brains. The future is open. It's not fixed. And that is wonderful news. It's wonderful news that the future is not fixed, because it means that we can still have an impact. The future is fuzzy. And of course, we can't know exactly what's going to happen. Our foresight is always imperfect. It's always limited. So futures work, I think, is essentially humility grounded at its best. I have seen examples where it's not so humility grounded, but when at its best, it can be. The future is surprising. It doesn't always arrive in smooth or continuous ways. Sometimes it arrives in really unexpected ways. The future is also not surprising. And sometimes the future is really boring. And it's interesting to hear people talk about COVID-19 as the most surprising thing that's ever happened, when a lot of people are saying, this is actually a pretty boring outcome. We knew this was coming. We've been telling you this is coming. Epidemiologists, zoologists, et cetera, have been saying something like this was coming. Nonetheless, those arguments are interesting. The future is fast. The future is always accelerating. And there's a whole literature and way of thinking about this. But a lot of futurists also say we have to balance that with the future is slow. Accelerating change gets all the attention, but a balance of the future is also slow, plotting, rather. And one might look to something like climate change to say, we're watching something happen in slow motion here. We're going to have serious cascades that feel like emergencies, but the truth is we're watching something happen profound. So futures work is a newish discipline. So it's newer than sociology, but it does have more than a 50-year history. There are journals, there are professional associations, there's a global community about managing exponential change. That change itself isn't linear anymore. We don't watch things change in a kind of order. We watch them change in a very exponential way. It is a philosophy, is a set of tools, it is skills. There are thousands of people around the world who operate as futurists and practice as futurists in a variety of traditions. There's not just one way to do it. They operate in the public sector, in the private sector, and across a variety of disciplines, which has been super fun for me. So what futures work isn't is predicting. Futures work is more like map making and navigating. It's not about controlling the future, which isn't possible anyway, but it is about pushing for and towards futures we want. The futures folks I hang around with are not about dominating the sector with one voice or one vision. That's dangerous, but it happens. It's not driven by current economic or political frameworks or goals, which is to say a concept like capitalism. Futures work isn't just about, let's just find a way think about the future of capitalism so we can make it work better. Let's think about something bigger, like what's best for the planet and humanity, or any particular political framework either. So futures is bigger than those things. Futures work is sometimes criticized for being elitist. supremacy anchored, and blinded. And I just want to acknowledge that I've seen examples of that. So I want to say that can be valid. I think that there are spaces, and I've seen practitioners working either in industries or for a variety of reasons that I'm just not interested in aligning with, and I don't have any common groundwork. I have found many, many more people that I do align with. So as I said, I ascribe critical futures thought, more pluralist, disruptive, network-based, equity, human, and sustainability centered, that's doing a constant power analysis, is iteratively, and thinking about challenging power relations in answer to the question, who gets to define the future? Who gets to do that? Just powerful people, or democratizing the futures through thought and practice? So just quick shout out about history. History really matters in futures work. History is full of patterns, and patterns tend to repeat in interesting ways. Not always, but frequently. And by the way, as Kurt Vonnegut said, history is merely a list of surprises. So things that happen are going to keep surprising us, and then later we'll call them history. But the truth is, it's always a bunch of things we hadn't thought necessarily might happen the way they did. I can't remember who said it, that famous quote, life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. So we're making history every moment, but we don't really understand what's happening until it's past. So I mentioned power a couple of times, and this is actually one of the spaces where very interesting futures work is going on, is thinking about the future of power itself. And as social workers, I think we don't talk enough about power and how power works, how it's organized. I think we endeavor to be powerful, to disrupt unsatisfactory power relations and renegotiate those. But the truth is, there's a lot of people working in this space of what is the future of power itself. We're coming out of an era that has been full of hierarchy-oriented power structures and into an era, some say, that is more of a networked power. There are books written, there are people doing research in this area. I have a lot of resources I can share. The top there is the hierarchy, the bottom is the network, and then over on the right-hand side, there's even different kinds of networks. So that's not even one, one network is not just one thing, there are many kinds of networks. I want to put that out there to just, again, stir your imagination to think, how does this apply to the way social workers work and the way we think about our work and in the different spaces that we occupy? So let me just move this over a little bit. Futurists are working in a variety of directions, and these next couple slides are going to talk to you about that. So there are people who are working on things like the future of social change and how, for example, social media or technology may influence the way social change happens in the future. The future of work, we're all getting a big lesson in that, right? The future of work is here and it's accelerating. This whole working at home thing, the future of organizational life. And we're seeing a lot of things on TV right now. What's the future of all our office spaces and our gathering spaces for the places we do work? And furthermore, to underscore this power dynamic, who gets to work at home and who doesn't? A lot of relevant issues. The future of cities, the future of technology, obviously of climate. The future of food is a huge issue. The future of communication, the future of identity, and human rights. And by identity, I mean things like, at what point does artificial intelligence created music get to copyright that? And, or what does artificial intelligence, at what point do they get to claim selfhood and an assortment of rights, somewhat like human rights? The future of racism and equity, which I'll talk more about this as we go along, but there are racial justice advocates who are working deeply in the tech spaces to sort of say there is a future of racism and equity and inequity that we really need to be paying attention to and that we are not paying attention to enough. The future of family life, the future of coupling and relationships. For whatever reason, last night, I must have had 10 different things show up on my Twitter feed about the future of sex. In a post-COVID, in a COVID world and in a post-COVID world, that made me laugh and laugh and laugh. Not the least of which is your Wi-Fi vibrator may be spying on you. That one really made me laugh. But anyway, fascinating. There are people working on the future of well-being, including both health and psychologically. the future of religion and spirituality, the future of trust, future of political life and democracy, the future of war, the future of peace, and not to mention, it's funny, last night when I was going over this, I realized I didn't put business, the future of business, but not to mention products galore and sort of the whole business apparatus, the economic apparatus globally. People are looking at the future of all these things. And when I go to a futures meeting, or when you'll meet people who are working on all these things. And there's a lot of interaction, a lot of give and take. It's utterly fascinating. Then we have a whole group of folks who are working on the future of professions themselves. So when you think about all the changes going on in all these spaces, how will this impact things like the future of doctoring? I've been to a couple meetings on the future of medicine, the future of nurses, all health professions, utterly fascinating. The future of education, teachers, both in K through 12, as well as where I sit in higher ed. The future of law is a huge area. A lot being written and done in that space. The future of journalism, the future of architecture, the future of divinity. These are all topics that are covered in this particular book, which I highly recommend, about the future of professions, which includes a deep history of the professions and what may lie ahead, essentially because of the ready availability of so much information and artificial intelligence. Will professions work the way they do now in the future? And a critique that really says, have the professions maybe reach their limits? Are we doing what we said we do? And he offers a very provocative question: are the professions failing? Most people who need a doctor can't necessarily get to a doctor globally, et cetera. So controversial, interesting, but powerful, and good things to think about. Then there are futures that work on futures consciousness and sort of the psychology of this, time perspectives, how people think about time, how cultures think about time, agency, our own sense of how much power we have to influence the future, openness to alternatives, systems perceptions of how things work, and concern for others. That particular research comes out of Finland, where they're doing really remarkable and exciting futures work and have been for many, many years. And I was blessed to be able to go to Finland earlier in my sabbatical when we still did things like that. And then there's lots of amazing voices emerging on the scene that are really challenging dominant narratives about these sort of official futures that get handed down. So this is just a small collection of books that I have, and I have lots of bibliographies I can share with you. Some of the books that I've been excited by that are really talking about the future of the things that I think we care about in social work. And my dream is, I really think these should be core kinds of textbooks in our social work learning spaces, both in education, but as well as in our continuing learning spaces. So futurists work in both quantitative and qualitative ways. And one of the quantitative methods are people that do trend analysis. And it's really about watching mentions and growth of different sectors. Amy Webb is one of my favorite ones. I have a link here on this slide to a tech trends report she does every year, which is really mind-blowing and interesting. I want to underscore by showing you this, that the future of social work is really not just about social work. The future of social work is about how can we as a profession be effective in the world that is unfolding, and how we can be effective in helping underrepresented voices co-create the world that is unfolding. But the future of social work is not just about what we do. It's about what we do in relationship to how the world is changing. So Amy's approach and her disruptor wheel here says you sort of put your organization in the middle. So let's take any social work organization, put that in the middle. Technology is a profound disruptor. And then things like wealth distribution, education, infrastructure, government, geopolitics, these are all additional disruptors. But it's not just individual disruptors. It's also about the way these disruptors intersect and create even more disruption, and sometimes unpredictable disruption. So at this moment, we're seeing like public health sort of rise up, number 7 there on that circle. We're seeing that rise up out of the circle, and think about how it is intersecting with every single one of these issues right now. It is dominating the way we're thinking about things, and both social problems and profound levels of social innovation may be happening in the space of those intersections. These are the ways that I think social workers should be embracing frameworks to imagine what our roles might be, what opportunities are to both prevent social problems or address the ones we've already got that are frankly getting worse. And I want to just say a thing about signals. I'll talk a lot more about this in the next webinar, but signals, trends are the markers we have about how things are changing. But signals are little elements usually around the edges. So if you were to look at just around the edge of this wheel, there are little signals coming up about new elements of change that powerful entities usually aren't watching. But futurists do. We gather signals and we talk a lot about them. So I'll chat more about that later. VUCA is another framework, and boy is VUCA relevant in post-normal times. The idea that the world around us is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. It's all these things. And I know when I revisited this framework a couple years ago, it actually made me feel a little better, ironically, because I thought it was just me, right? But the truth is the world is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I think any profession that doesn't embrace the idea that we find our way through this is really missing the mark. All of our theories, all of our models are trying to operate in spaces that are volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. The good news is we can find a way through that, but we have to start by acknowledging that we have to build in agility and an ability to flex with everything we do right now. Having ironclad plans is just going to get us into trouble in a lot of ways. We have to retain some flexibility. What's around the next corner and how do we use narratives? So on the left is a wonderful picture that I got at the Future of Medicine conference talking about how the medical apparatus, boy, does that feel true now, how the medical infrastructure globally was sort of operating as all these giant trends were crashing down on it. And that narrative is profound. And I think the idea of flattening the curve and watching what our health professionals have gone through in the last few months, I mean, it's felt a little like that. That is one way of looking at the future. And it's one that's not invalid. The future can be big and overwhelming and scary. The future on the right, or the model on the right, is the idea of maybe thinking less that we're a vulnerable little boat with a big wave about to crash us over, but maybe it would be helpful to also use the narrative that we're in a kayak, and we're in a kayak with others. That traditional levers to steer our way through these rapids are not necessarily going to work. The tempo and the strategies we take need to be dictated by the times we live in, not just our mental map of what it used to be like. And that success is messy and it depends on collective action. The left may be true in many respects, but we have almost no chance if we sort of live with that as our metaphor for what we're trying to do. I like the version on the right better. I want to be honest and say it's scary times, and these do feel sometimes like overwhelming risks and things we're up against. But to build our agency, to build our power and our sense that we can actually make a difference, I like the model on the right better. In fact, Bob Johansen, I mentioned before, said the ability to flip from a frightening VUCA of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity to a hopeful VUCA, vision, understanding, clarity, and agility, will be the ultimate dilemma for leaders in the future. So futures work uses both sides of the brain. So to Amy Webb's point, you use sort of data and trend analysis and all different kinds of things. But you also, futurists use a lot of divergent thinking, creativity, stretch exercises, a lot of qualitative information. When you go into future spaces, you meet a lot of artists, which is so interesting and fun because almost never in our professional meetings do we do that. So you have scientists and artists sitting across the table from each other talking about things. It's very cool. This is a map of kind of back to that possible, plausible, probable, and preferable futures, although it blows it out a little more, has the preposterous on there. And this is a futures cone, and Dr. Cherry pointed out that it does look like sort of the cone, the kinds of cells in one's eyes, and I think that's an interesting analogy. I never thought of that before. But now is on the left-hand side, and futurists use this as a framework to, again, help people make their minds more elastic. The future is plural. It's not just one thing. And the sort of ethical obligation we have to help people stretch and imagine different futures. And then, of course, throw themselves into the future they want and defend against the future they don't want. So we'll get into a lot more of that when we get into the how futures practice works. my definition, again, is deepen capacity to anticipate in new ways, build collective imagination, intelligence, agency, and agility. We do this to face real challenges, not just to navel gaze, but feel like co-creators of the future than possible bystanders. I want to underscore it's easy to think of the future as the future's work as the future of this or that, but it's really bigger than one sector. Futurists work across sectors. The future is the intersections of these things. The future of any one thing is connected to the future of everything. It's a very big concept, very transdisciplinary. I have talked about futures work as being sort of applied science fiction, and we'll really get into that later too. A variety of schools, theories, perspectives, not just one way of doing it. So these are just some of the terms and language that you might see at a typical futures conference, and I want to run through them quickly just to give you a taste. Afrofuturism, queer, feminist, crip futurism, Latinx, indigenous futures, these location, identity-based futurisms are fascinating, growing, powerful, dynamic. I recently learned about collapse psychology, which is sort of an emerging psychological area focused on acknowledging that we are trying to be well in the midst of many systems collapsing around us, and that is taking a toll. So there's a whole new emerging psychological practice around that. Managed retreat is what's happening with low-lying communities who are trying to move to higher ground. We've just had that incredible flood in Michigan. There are many places in the world and a couple of cities that are really looking at how do we move an entire city, because in a number of years it will be underwater. Precariat class is a term used by futurists who work in economic space to talk about, it literally is connected to the word precarious, and we've learned a lot about this as well. A whole group of people who are vulnerable in terms of their work. And we see this in social work, we see it in education. Degrowth is imagining the possibility that unrestricted, unbridled growth is not our only economic model. Edward Abbey once said, unlimited growth is the ideology of the cancer cell. Is there a different way? So out of Europe comes the new sort of economic model that people are playing around with and actually doing some deep thinking and work with related to the concept of degrowth as a more sustainable. Misfit economies is something I'll talk more about. An enormous amount of the global product economic output is under the table. And so misfit economies are really looking at how the economy really works, not just the one we talk about in the stock market. Fascinating. Calm technology has to do with the impact of all this technology on us. And Amber Case is an amazing futurist working at looking at different ways of decomplicating and making technology more human. And more in sync with the kind of healthy life that we want, not just beeping and booping at us all the time. It's fascinating. Global brain, resilience hubs, cyborg anthropology. By the way, Amber also does cyborg anthropology, and she says we're all already cyborgs. Look up that TED Talk. It's a lot of fun. Panopticon is the state in which we're being watched all the time. It's a way of organizing a society so that everyone's under surveillance. Some say we're very close to that. Post-capitalism, active group of people working on those spaces, and democracy 2.0. So what I want to say is these are all topics that get talked about at futures conferences, and they were being talked about way before COVID. But back to that intersecting idea, imagine how all of these things intersect now with the reality of COVID in our world and the ways that it will change our world. It's already showing us a lot of things related to that. So the next few slides are going to be different kinds of maps that futurists use. Everybody doing okay? I just want to do a human check-in with all of you and have you breathe, because sometimes this is a lot. And webinar formats don't work super great with this many people for a lot of dialogue. We'll get into some questions very shortly, but just breathe. So this next set of slides is about how some people view the future. This particular one is projected growth in the Internet of Things. So remember when the internet used to just be the internet? Now, then we all got Fitbits. And then before you knew it, we all had smart toasters or whatever, thermostats or whatever else. The truth is now there are smart body parts. We apparently love to have things hooked up to the internet. And growth in this sector is exploding, partially connected to health kinds of things, which are interesting. It's smart body parts. Some of it's related to smart cities. And the ability of sensors themselves to be produced very inexpensively and then measure all kinds of things. But the truth is, this is sort of an official future. This is powerful people telling us how the future is going to be. But nonetheless, this is powerful people telling us how the future is going to be. And we all have choices and decisions to make about whether or not we think that's a good future or a future we want to be part of. The Internet of Things is powerful. And again, I sort of laughingly say your vibrator is spying on you. The truth is we have internet connected everything, including your vibrator. So might want to remember that. Okay, here's another map of the way futurists look at things. Down the left-hand side is sort of an overview of how things have been progressing recently. The internet, social computing, mobile computing, cloud computing, big data analytics, 3D printing, renewable energy, this Internet of Things we were just talking about, nanotechnology, robotics, blockchain. So this is all things that are here now. But some futurists think this is the way that arc in terms of technology and the implications of it is going to play out over the next 5 to 10 years. Smart grids, connected cars, smart homes, which by the way are here. The largest home builders in the country are using deeply smart home technology. Smart cities are here, though there is a resistance to that. Connected healthcare, automation of everything, healthy life extension. I'm just going up the list here. Money 2.0, institution 2.0, democracy 2.0, et cetera. So who gets to decide this, right? The whole point of futures work is, hey, that's really interesting, but does that work for everybody? And why am I showing this to you? Because when I look at things like this as a social worker, and often one of the few social workers in the room, I raise my hand and like, well, who decided this? And who wins, who loses from this? And I just ask a lot of basic good social work questions that sometimes nobody's been asking those questions, or worse yet, sometimes people don't care. And so I think part of my rationale for saying social work needs to be in the mix is that I'm constantly looking, as I'm sure all of you would, looking at that thinking, well, some of those things could definitely uplift humanity and vulnerable people, but only if they're done in an equitable way. And so how's that going to happen? Who's going to decide that? This is why social workers need to be in these spaces. These are very tiny images. I'm going to do more with these in the next webinar, but I just want to give you a taste. This is the Institute for the Future has new post-COVID scenarios, and you can look those up if you want to, but they have to do with other kinds of maps of looking at multiple kinds of futures. So in this one, up in the upper left-hand side, there's a growth, constraint, collapse, and transformation scenario that they have been developing using some of their models and frameworks. And this is another way of mapping out not just one future, but really mapping out different kinds of futures, and then thinking about what would be the control or leverage we have to lean away from the future we don't want and towards the future we do. This next couple slides is about the future of human rights. I put it in purely for mind-blowing value. I just want to say that ahead of time. But at the Future of Medicine conference I went to a while ago, there's a lot of work being done in this space. Where human rights are being discussed, I feel like social workers also need to be contributing. These are 4 new human rights that are proposed, and I'm going to take you through each one. The right to cognitive liberty, the right to mental privacy, the right to mental integrity, and the right to psychological community. So the first one has to do with the right to cognitive liberty. And thinking about your mind is where you make your personal decisions. It's where we operate mentally, right? It's connected to our bodies, but it's also related to what we believe, we say, and do, and that we should preserve that as a fundamental human right. We're at a point in history where we need to say that. Organizations and communities should not be able to forcibly manipulate the mental states and implicitly the brain states of individual citizens. And people should have the right to refuse coercive uses of neurotechnology, the right to cognitive literacy or liberty. The next one is the right to mental privacy. So thanks to the internet, of course, we know our personal information has never been more available, but what happens when organizations or governments are able to record data straight out of our brains? And I know this sounds like a sci-fi movie, but things are moving in directions where this could be a possibility. We don't always have direct control over our thoughts. And as researchers point out, even if someone has consented to an EEG, the device could theoretically in the future pick up more information than the person wanted to share. So the team's idea of mental privacy could be satisfied by ensuring that devices can only read the brainwaves the person explicitly agrees to, and the information gathered should be protected from leaking all over the internet. Amazing, right? But I've seen, like, there's examples of ways where we are recording brainwaves in deepening levels of sophistication. So we're at a time in history where we might want to talk about this. The right to mental integrity. So if a shady third party is messing around with your computer without your knowledge, it could corrupt you, it could hijack you in terms of your computer. But imagine if that computer is your brain. And corruption there could literally crash your brain. So brain-computer interfaces are already coming into use for prosthetics that be controlled through thought. I've seen these, you know, a prosthetic arm that is literally getting connected into your brain. It's an amazing, amazing time to be alive. Patients come to think of them as their own limbs. But could these devices be, for some reason, remotely accessible? Could somebody seize control of your left hand? And to protect people from that kind of horror story and that slippery slope, mental integrity is also thought of as a human right. And then psychological continuity. So this is the eternal sunshine of the spotless mind scenario. Should people, people build their identity on memories, thoughts, and neuroscience is beginning to uncover ways to actively alter those things. Memories can be implanted or erased, potentially leading to behavior changes, either deliberately or through carelessness, which could result in people losing their sense of self. Preserving that is what researchers call a right to psychological continuity. And I recently have been seeing some things, given the facial recognition boom that's going on. I saw another news item recently that people should be all copyrighting our faces, because as artificial intelligence and facial recognition begins to sort of collect our face prints, that's a term, we want to make sure that we actually own our own face print. So obviously these are rather mind-blowing. Is anyone else having a mind-blowing time out there? You doing all right? Everybody okay? But again, it's better. These are being discussed actively. We need to be in these discussions. We need to be aware of them, and we need to think about how they impact vulnerable people. And we invite those vulnerable people in to have their own say about that. Design justice is another cool framework that is related to sort of, there's been a big boom in recent years around design thinking. Which is about, is the future just one big complex of design challenges? Can we design our way beyond the situation we're in? If we're going to tear it down, we better design something better. But design justice focuses on the way design reproduces or challenges what this author calls a matrix of domination: white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, capitalism, ableism, settler colonialism, and other forms of structural inequality. So design justice and a group of practitioners globally are working on a design justice network, growing community of practice that aims to ensure a more equitable distribution of design's benefits and burdens. So lovely, interesting. And then other ways, spaces people are working in that I think are particularly relevant to social work are those working in the algorithmic racism spaces. And there are many people doing this. There's something called the Algorithmic Justice League. There's really cool people, but my favorite, and one of, I'm in the executive committee of her fan club, is Ruha Benjamin, who's written this book called Race After Technology. Just read a couple of quotes from her book. With emerging technology, we might assume that racial bias will be scientifically rooted out. Yet rather than challenging or overcoming the cycles of inequity, technical fixes too often reinforce or even deepen the status quo. She calls it the new Jim Code, the employment of new technologies that reproduce existing inequities, but they're promoted and perceived as more objective or progressive than the discriminatory systems of a previous era. Coded inequity, creating a kind of digital case system that preys on our naivete. Racism then becomes doubled, magnified and buried under layers of digital denial. Ruha's book should be core reading for every social worker who cares about equity. And there's lots available about her on the internet. She does a lot of speaking, and she's just an amazing, very accessible person. So I urge you to look forward in her direction. But this issue of how social justice issues will also morph and transform in the coming years is something we really need to be paying attention to. These technologies are powerful. Algorithms, I read once the other day that an average person interacts with 70 or 80 algorithms in a day that sort us into categories at this moment in history. If racism and other forms of inequity get coded into those things, it becomes a whole different social problem. So things to expect. Ethics is something that goes on and is part of futures practice. What is that about? It's about ultimately our obligation to future generations. And as one of my fellow futurists, Jane McGonigal, says, to not regret the things we build. So there's a framework called Ethical OS you can Google to sort of look at these risk zones. That's what's on the screen in the diagram: trust, information, propaganda, disinformation, addiction and dopamine economy, economic and asset inequalities, algorithmic biases, surveillance state, data control and monetization, implicit trust and user understanding, and hateful and criminal actors. We have to get rigorous about applying ethics in these tech spaces in new ways. And we have to be really careful and good about that. In social work, we must participate in that. And I'll give you some examples about how artificial intelligence is being, sort of silently and under the radar moved into social work practice. So a lot of people don't know that artificial intelligence algorithms are being used a lot in child welfare or in juvenile justice or in other spaces in justice worlds. And I think social workers are sometimes finding themselves using this information without understanding where it came from, without understanding what some of the issues might be, about how problems might be embedded in it or how to push back against those. Ethics also is related to being transparent about how and why we work at as futurists, what kind of frameworks we work out of, and ultimately to promote human and planetary well-being as defined by humans, not a bunch of humans, not just a few. And then there's the complexities of the digital life world. So we have a lot of work happening. These are spaces where futurists and technologists are working to sort of help us understand that our lives are increasingly operating in kind of a digital life world, which is complicated. And that means that, and we know that social work, and there's a handful of social workers who are really starting to have been, actually for the last 4 or 5 years, really diving in deeply to these kinds of spaces to say, where does social work belong in this? Should we be creating some of these frameworks, or at least influencing the ones that are already up and running? Of course, we have robots. They are here. And with a crisis in caregiving, there's all kinds of interesting uses of robotics. They are coming. They're here. They're being experimented with in all kinds of spaces. Again, questions social workers might ask is, who gets to use these? Who doesn't? What are the pluses and minuses? What are the vulnerabilities built into this? And who should decide how much of this should proceed? But COVID, again, gives us an interesting window into this whole issue, and thinking about how dangerous it's been for some of the caregivers. I try to stay somewhat agnostic to some of these things because, again, we should open up to the full range of possibilities. I don't want to just say robots are good or robots are bad. Well, robotics is a big, powerful tool that smart, interesting people are coming up with. And some of them are very good people, and they're genuinely trying to make this a useful thing to help more people do the things we want to do and be well as long as we can be. But I also think there's obviously a downside. So how do we get in there and have those dialogues and co-create? And then how about digital humans? Like, that's a thing. Amy calls these synthetic humans. The one on the right there is a new TV anchorman. That is a synthetic human coming out of China. And when I was at the Future of Medicine conference, we learned a lot about digital assistants. So I'm going to wield my technological power here and take you over to YouTube so that you can see what this looks like. So everybody take a deep breath, and we're just going to hope that this works. This is what synthetic humans look like. These aren't real. They're CGI generated. Later in this little video, you'll see some of the ways that this is being used. So like me, you may be a little creeped out. I hope everybody's still seeing. Now we're back to hopefully the same screen we were before. So synthetic humans is a real thing. I mean, that's coming, and it is fascinating to see the ways that it's being used. And in the moment, we want to say, who does that work for? Who does that not work for? Oh my gosh, somebody's going to come out with a synthetic human social worker. What about that? What do we think about that? Are we ready for that? Is that something we want or don't want? So again, interesting times we live in, but digital humans are here. Synthetic humans are here. And I actually just saw that one of the biggest talent agencies, think about TV production and the fact that everybody's, when are these things going to get back together? The first synthetic human actor was just joined the representation of one of the largest actors guilds in the world. I mean, fascinating time to be alive, but concerning as well. I guess I have to lean into my bias here and say I'm generally creeped out, but I'm open to what might happen next. I mentioned artificial intelligence in social work. I just want to show you a map of what AI in healthcare looks right now. It looks like right now. This is a slide from the Future of Health conference, looking at all the different ways that artificial intelligence companies are experimenting and working throughout the healthcare ecosystem. Social workers are in that healthcare ecosystem. They are trying to do social work. Advocates are trying to do this. We're working on health equity. Think of all the social work, social justice issues that are embedded into our sense of health equity and social determinants of health. And imagine how important it is for us to be in there, sending up flares, asking questions, participating in these conversations. I want to say, having learned some about some of these things, some of these are extraordinary opportunities, and I don't want to demonize AI in healthcare because I think I am learning so much about the degree to which new possibilities for human health really are being charted and uncovered vis-a-vis some of these technologies. The question is not, is it good or bad? The question is, who benefits from it and who won't? And just to bring it back to COVID, a lot of the people and systems that are trying to find us a cure for COVID are using artificial intelligence to more rapidly test combinations of genetic information and different kinds of pharmacological information that you might take us 5 years to do it. If humans did it, it might be doable in 6 months if we have artificial intelligence working those things much more quickly. So I don't want to demonize artificial intelligence. It's more around the ethics and the worldview that we bring to those things, those spaces. So of course, obviously, futurists are talking about climate change and human life. I'm going to move through these. And of course, now everything intersects with COVID. My favorite of all the interesting little things that have popped up. No, we're not all in the same boat. We're in the same storm. There's a huge difference. So all of these other things I've talked about intersect. I like to just take a break here and say it's bad. And it's also an amazing time to be alive. But as social workers, we look around and know that there's a lot to take in. So I just like to take a moment at this point in the presentation and have you all just sit back and please take a deep breath. And I've put along some put in here some dopamine enhancement devices. So just pick one and take a nice deep breath as we continue on. How are we doing on time? I'm going to move through the rest of this pretty quickly. So playing with ideas is Artifacts of the Future is a tool. I'm going to take virtual reality as a case in point. And just in the moment, how many of you have ever done VR or might be VR aficionados? It's a big thing right now. This is another sort of trend we're watching. On the left side of this diagram is 2014. This is about investments in hardware and software that are growing exponentially, right? VR is coming. It was coming before COVID. And boy, is it really coming after COVID, because the truth is we're not going to go to a big concert hall anytime soon. But we might have a VR concert in our living room. And I'm actually watching hologram technology too, because I want Bruce Springsteen to sing in my living room. That's what I want. But anyway, VR is here. It's coming. It was a big deal before. Folks who are working in that sector are talking about these are all the sectors that will be not just a little bit disrupted by virtual reality and extended reality, but extremely disrupted. I'll just let you take a look at that. So a futurist, that's a very official futures. Here it comes. We don't have any control over it. It's coming at us, and we're just can't wait to see what fun things it will do to make our lives better, right? That's sort of the dominant ideology or the dominant view. A futurist named Stuart Candy said, what if we developed an artifact of the future? We gave you sort of a visceral opportunity to take this data and this idea that artificial or VR is here and it's going to dominate everything, it's going to disrupt everything, and we're all going to be learning how to do it together. What if we created an artifact of the future that would make us think twice? And so he came up with this artifact of the future. It's called the Nurture Pod. And so there's a whole group of futurists who work on these artifacts of the future. They create experiences or artifacts that are sort of in the future and invite you to think about them, to feel them, not just think about them. And then ask a series of questions. What led up to this practice? Who decided that it was a good idea to do this? Who's at risk and what kind of risk from this future? Who benefits? What would the social work code of ethics say about the Nurture Pod? And is this a future you want to live in? So lots to think about there. We'll talk more about this in the next webinar, but just give you a little taste. I love this particular artifact of the future, a billboard that says, you're okay, you don't need to buy a single thing. We want nothing from you. Thanks for existing. Dystopian futures are easier, but I also want to say, what are utopian futures? What are breakthrough pro-humanity, pro-ecological political movements, green revolutions, global mutual aid networks, youth movements, care movements, indigenous rights revolution, a renaissance of equity? I want that future. Scientific breakthroughs for global flourishing. I want that future. Post-capitalism economic frameworks and a renaissance of meaning. So to wrap up, and then we'll go into some questions, where does social work belong in this? What might social work be changed by if we included futures work or frameworks in our core knowledge base? And as importantly, how might it change us? But how might we also change futures work by our presence and our input? So I have just a few questions as we wrap up. What is the future of how inequity will emerge in these new spaces? And I've only covered a fraction of what's out there. What core knowledge might social workers need to better anticipate what might be coming next in this social political environment and be effective in creating more equity? How is this like or unlike our current knowledge? How can the moral imagination that we bring to the world be especially valuable in navigating this change? How will transitions between eras around the future of work or the future of tech, of health, impact vulnerable people, and who's advocating in this area? What are the most likely ways that social work itself will be or should be changing in the years ahead? And how do we protect what is most important about our profession as the future marches on? Where do we need most to grow? So I end my remarks today with this, this beautiful quote by Arundhati Roy. Historically, pandemics have forced humanity to reckon with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. So to get our hands around that, we need to imagine bigger. And I leave you with just slides to urge you to think about in the coming days. What makes you anxious, excited, angry, scared, curious about the future? Those are your doorways. Go into those doorways. What kind of story will we write about what happens next? We belong in those spaces. In the next session, I'm going to go deep into how this practice works. So this session again was about what it is. And I just want to give a shout out to the National Network of Social Work Managers, Dr. Cherry Idalia, to Fordham and to Portland State. And here's some ways to stay connected to me. So with that, I will stop and we'll do a few questions. Thank you very much, everybody. I hope your mind is a little bit blown. That was my goal.
That was great. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Dr. Nissen. So yeah, we are opening the floor to questions. So if you have any questions, go ahead and submit those into the question tab and we will to work on those.
So I'm looking, what instructional resources would you recommend for social work students, especially grad students, to use Futures frameworks to start for strategy, planning, and innovation? I mean, what I've tried to do on my blog, this whole learning out loud, is I've tried to start thinking about that. I've tried to start thinking about and gathering information that I think social work futurists might want to have. And we're in the process. I've just written a paper. I'm starting to gather other enthusiastic people on this topic. The truth is, we've got to write that. So what it is for social work, that doesn't exist right now. So we have to come together and we have to work as a profession to write that. That's that set of stories, and we'll argue about it. Not all social workers will feel the same way, and that's good. We will deepen our bench on that issue. But come to my blog in the short run, in which it's just sort of a futures palooza for social workers. So that's one thing. You've already convinced me of the need for more social workers to be futurists. Yes. Can you begin to describe what the next steps are for us to learn and begin doing this work? Well, the next two webinars are going to be entirely about that. So, but what I would say is it's about learning. It's about jumping into this community and learning. There is so much information going around. I find Twitter to be an incredibly great place to jump on. I urge you to visit my blog. I also urge you to visit the Institute for the Futures blog, iftf.org. They have extraordinary resources, and it's a fun place to just sort of explore. But in the last couple of years, I've probably been to 10 or 15 futures conferences. I've done interdisciplinary ones. I've done big downloads all on the blog about what happened there, including that future of medicine. So I'd love to know the resources you mentioned on the future of power, hierarchy versus network, centralized. So I would urge you, first of all, to just Google the future of power. And there are some things on my blog about this. I'm going to talk more about that as the weeks go by as well. But there is just a lot of good stuff out there. Chloe is your name. I have a book, but I came down to my office, so I'd have better internet. I don't have it with me. That is one of my favorite books on the future of power. And I will make sure and mention that explicitly in the future. I don't think I've done a review of it yet. I'm trying to think what it's called. It's completely out of my head. But there's a particular book I've read recently that I loved on the future of power and how we need to learn more about it. So I'll make sure and mention it in the next webinar. Is there work being done on the futures of nonprofit profession, not category? Yes, there are quite a few futurists who are working in that space. The nonprofit sector was precarious 6 months ago, I have to say. It is even more precarious now. I think a lot of futurists and nonprofit advocates are figuring out how do we save and protect the nonprofit sector in general. It's a very intense time. Yes, there are people, and I have a lot of that stuff. There's also a ton of people doing futures work with government. So IFTF has a whole government futures lab, and the future of government is another utterly fascinating area. Hello, Elaine. How do you think expressive arts will or is already connected and weave in with futurist thinking or futurism? Well, so many ways. I mean, artists have always and will always help us think bigger, help us think outside our boundaries. So the role of the arts is held in extraordinarily high esteem, and not just visual arts, but also next time we talk about how futures practice works, speculative fiction, the link to science fiction and some of those kinds of things. So anyway, arts are very important, and there's a lot of fun stuff going on. How does one stay clear of stepping into conspiracy thinking with the examples of futures thinking issues you mentioned? Opticon or panopticon, constant surveillance, elitist power deciding the future, etc. I mean, I would say that if you look at, there are futurists like, there's a futurist who's done some really interesting work on exponential propaganda. There's good social science about surveillance nation and surveillance capitalism. There's really good, credible social science about this. And the future of cities and those kinds of things, I do think it's important to not contribute to conspiracy theories, but I also think it's important to go beyond sort of what we're being told. And the more I'm reassured by powerful entities that there's nothing to worry about, the more I worry. That's sort of the social worker in me, but I do think we have to be careful not to promote conspiracy theories, but neither to deny that having a surveillance nation that a few people are benefiting from. If you want to read a really interesting book about power, is another Amy Webb book. She has a book called The Big Nine, and it's about the biggest tech companies in the world, 6 in the United States, 3 in China, and the degree to which they are creating a future set of future scenarios that are being decided by a very few people without democratic process. We're not making that up. That's happening. So it's complicated. And so we have to just keep acknowledging that. Thank you for a wonderful discussion. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how two features, technology and indigenous, hang together in a world of futures thinking. Well, I would direct you to indigenous futures, that landscape, that whole sector. If you just Google indigenous futures, I have a bunch of links on my web in some of the interesting links, and in the Afrofuturism section, there's a whole bunch of links to other things, queer futures, etc. But indigenous futurisms, just Google that, and you'll find a whole interesting array of indigenous futurists who are thinking about those things. Yes, this webinar will be available for future review. A lot of this sounds like intensive thought and research work. Can you explain how futures work translates into action and what concrete role social workers can play in those spaces? That is a question that we'll be talking about the next two. Sorry to keep saying that, but this webinar was just intended to talk about what it is. And then the next two are really how it works and how it might work for social work. So those are my challenges. What was to sort of stick with what it is. So be patient, Molly, and please come back and we'll get into a lot of that. It sounds like intensive thought and research work. It is at the front end. I mean, what futures work is a lot of intensive thinking, scanning, gathering, organizing, listening, watching, reflecting on history. That is a lot of what what futures work is. Then you put all those things together with a set of tools driven by some of the theories we've talked about. What existing theoretical framework can social workers use to conduct research in this area? An example would be appreciative inquiry. So I don't know how much time I'm going to spend talking about research specifically. I do have on my blog a pretty extensive annotated bibliography of futures resources. I believe it's called the Never-Ending, Constantly Changing Bibliography. And in that are a lot of examples of research frameworks that futurists are using and some research articles that are being used. So I would direct you to that to get some more ideas. How can you share examples of non-tech futures projects or inquiries you're following? I mean, there's a ton of stuff happening in the climate change spaces. There's a lot happening in mutual aid and I think youth movements, just a lot of interesting things. But it's interesting, almost none of these completely doesn't intersect with tech. It goes back to that circle. Is tech so pervasive at this point? And I would say, have we let tech get so pervasive at this point that it intersects with almost everything else we're working on, we're thinking about? That's an interesting plausibility, right? So, but anyway, there's a lot going on, and my blog, there's a lot of other kinds of things. But I would say if you look at climate change, if you look at different kinds of movements that are happening, But I'm hard to think of any that don't intersect in some way with futures projects. I would say there's, in social work, and I was going to talk about this in the third webinar, there is a whole detox, like tech detox group that is sort of saying we as a species need to unhook ourselves from technology a little more and protect and explore what non-tech spaces are for humans and for the planet. And that's interesting. Is a social work job of the future to be a detox specialist for technology? I wonder. Hello, Juan. Can you discuss a bit of your forecast ideas around the integration of 5G and what implications will be for social work practice? Well, you know, 5G is another one of those big things that we're getting enormous amounts of official futures. We're being told by powerful entities that 5G is just going to be the thing that transforms everything. And I think it's a powerful thing. Juan, I would love to just sit and have a coffee with you. And I bet if the two of us sat there for 15 minutes, we could come up with 100 ways that 5G could help people or could hurt people in the days to come. And the question is not, are there good or bad implications? The question is, because there really will be both. The question is, who will decide that? And who will be in those spaces fighting for the good and preventing the bad? And that's why big tech needs social workers, as Dr. Desmond Patton says. Big tech needs a social worker on staff all the time. What would be your best advice for someone who has recently graduated and is entering the field during these times be? Well, I'm trying to write a social work futures class right now, and I'm really thinking that a good starting point would be to say, what am I interested in? What's the sector I was planning on going into? So child welfare, I'm going into child welfare. Okay, if you're going into child welfare and that's what you love, then I would just urge you to start dedicating yourself to the idea that the future of social work, or the future of social work practice in child welfare is a space that is full of interesting ideas, full of important opportunities, also full of risks. And I would urge you to start pursuing that, gathering information, learning, talking to people. Artificial intelligence is big. How is that being used? Who's done research on that? I would just Google the future of child welfare practice and see what you get. Find those scholars, start learning. One of the things I want to say about futures practice is that it's not just a one-time event, it is a practice. So it is something you don't just do one time. It's about adjusting the way that we work to be present to what is emerging and take up space in advocating for the things that we care about. Rick Greenberg, perhaps I missed it, but in the video on artificial faces, were they all white? I might have blinked and missed the POC. If not, what is behind that and what are the implications of that? I do think that what I thought about those artificial faces, beings, I love that. Isn't Soul Machine a creepy thing to call them? Anyway, respect to Soul Machine, I guess. But no, I think several of them were biracial. I think there was a multiracial kind of tone that I think they were trying to set there. But I do think, you know, enduring whiteness in tech spaces is a well-researched, well-documented problem with white supremacy that just has to be taken on. And there's a lot of people working on that. A lot of people, interesting people working on those spaces. Hi, Lori. Thanks, Laura. Feels like social work is a little behind the curve. Where do you think we should start? Is there a niche that you think social work can have an impact in? I think that is a really important question for us. I mean, I think part of the reason I wrote this grant to RWJF is to create a gathering space, which is explicitly for social workers to talk about this and create our frameworks for how we should operate. So, Lori, I think that's a really important place I want to be starting with that group, but I also want to start it bigger. And I do have a hashtag social work futures on Twitter. I urge social workers who might want to talk about that. Let's share ideas. Let's use that hashtag on Twitter, at least for now, and engage with each other. But I think we're behind the curve, but recognizing you, Lori, and many other social workers in these spaces, it's not like social work's been asleep at the wheel. We have social workers and social work academics who are doing work in these spaces, really exciting work. And I'll talk about those in more detail in the third webinar. But I think we should start with a strength-based approach. Where are we already starting to do great work in these areas? Hi, Anna. If one of the core values of social work is the importance of human relationships, what does that mean when we think about AI, synthetic humans, avatars, and other forms of tech where humans are in relationships with things we think of as non-humans? How can we have a real futures conversation to consider if that may be possible, that only some of us will be interacting with, being cared for by, in relationship with humans versus tech? It's just so true. I mean, I just say yes. I think that's, I don't have a perspective other than I totally agree with you. And what I believe strongly is that I've seen a couple of scenarios where this is particularly becoming an issue with elder care internationally, that there is a caregiving tsunami coming, they say, where we're just not going to have enough caregivers for the number of people, elders who are going to need care. So how do we build that out? And I've seen a couple of interesting scenarios and projections by companies who are wanting to build out elder care infrastructure globally that involve some of these things. And again, I don't want to say that's all evil or bad, or it's all good and that's the solution. I don't think we're there yet. These things are half-baked, and that's the point. They're emergent. So I think we as social workers have to get comfortable getting into these emergent spaces and just being part of the problem solving and using the power that we have. And again, the moral imagination that we have to think about, is there a way through that? Because the truth is, Dr. Cherry and I were talking about this yesterday, you know, if I'm an elder person who is in the early stages of Alzheimer's and I need to talk with somebody 18 hours a day about my medications, and I need to repeat that over and over and over and over again in order to feel safe and good, maybe it's okay that I do that with an avatar or a synthetic human. Maybe those kinds of assistance. And maybe I'd rather talk to somebody like that than pressing 9 buttons on my phone. Maybe that would be, maybe there are spaces where this will actually benefit humanity. But I don't think we're there yet. These are emergent ideas. And so I simply feel like social work shouldn't wait to figure out how that should work. Maybe we have a better idea, or maybe we have a way that should actually flex. Hi, Rachel. What can we do as current practitioners and social work alumni to help influence the future of social work education? I would say get involved, jump in. As I said before, I don't necessarily have a deep recommendation for what we should do right now beyond we should gather. We should gather, and we should gather our power and our expertise and our guts and our anger and our bravery, and we should gather, and we should be talking about this on the regular. It shouldn't be a thing we do over here or in just one webinar. We need to be talking about it a lot, and we need to influence our powerful structures that dictate and control. But a lot of those structures, we are that. I mean, we're all members of NASW or CSWE. We are that. So we have to create more spaces, formal spaces, informal spaces. I think we need to deepen our culture around being curious and engaged in these kinds of conversations. So I hope that helps, but I just think we jump in. And as I said, I feel like my job on earth right now is just to create spaces where we can be doing that and encourage others to do it, not control them, because they're uncontrollable. I want to create a network, not a hierarchy. I know the questions, concerns for us to consider is there. However, are there any referrals as guidance we can follow as social workers? I mean, I know, I think I've been doing a lot of chatting with people. I know several people are working on ethics, you know, intersecting with social work ethics. I think that is the place where maybe that is the most fruitful place for us to start really diving in together, because there's so much ethics talk going on right now globally. That could be a really rich space to say, is our code of ethics ready for the future? Because guess what? Medicine isn't, nursing is. I mean, these are in deep states of constant revision and observation. I think, you know, when social workers first started using social media, you know, I have to say, and I'm devoted to social work. I'm very much a social worker, but it's like the whole field just exploded and our heads blew up because we all started using social media. Really? Like, that's just the beginning of what's out there. We've got to evolve faster. We've got to be more courageous and more hardy about saying, you know what, we can handle it. Let's handle it. Let's duke it out. We can't control all of what's happening. Let's get ready to help our profession get ready, not run from it or put our head in the sand. So I think we got to do better and evolve faster. And Kareen, I think is your name. I mean, I would just say, again, I've tried to document my guidance to social workers in a variety of ways. There's just a bunch of thought experiments and a ton of resources on my blog. Do you think we should be encouraging, supporting more social work students to pursue dual degrees, MSW, MPH? Well, I think the future is about cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary thinking. So I think dual degrees are awesome ways to deepen that, but I don't think they're the only way. So you can be a great public health anchored MSW without having an MPH, and you can be very socially justice oriented in your MPHness without having an MSW. But I think they're great to have. I'm more in the space of really thinking about the future of degrees themselves these days, and how, what is the future of higher education and what's the future of credentialing? I mean, all that stuff is going to be shifting as well. So, I mean, I'm a proud holder of an MSW, and I believe in them deeply, and I think we are one of the fastest growing professions. So I think the MSW is going to be around for a long time, but I don't think dual degrees are the only way to do it. I think they're awesome, but I don't think they're the only way to do it. And frankly, dual degrees might not always, I'd be interested in dual degrees like social work and computer technology, right? Or social work and, social work and law is already recognized, but what might it look like if social work and sustainability, that was a dual degree, or other kinds of dual degrees that maybe aren't as common. Let's mix it up. Let's get competent in spaces, because I want to see social workers building apps and building maybe apps that challenge other apps. We'll dive into a lot of this in the next session about how things work, but I think we're just about out of time. Ooh, we're over time.
No worries. I think I can speak for everyone and just say, wow, that was quite the trip. Thank you again so much for taking the time to have this, provide us with this information and just the informative presentation. And thank you for everyone that was able to join us today. As a quick reminder, the webinar recording and the slide deck will be available on our website within 48 hours in the webinar archives section. So thank you again. Take care, everyone. Be safe, be well, and have a great rest of the day.
Bye.